Keith, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So tell us first of all, what is the Dart League King all about?
It takes place in one night in a bar, in kind of a dive bar in a small town in North Idaho. And it's centered around the Dart League Championship, which doesn't sound like much of a plot, but there are all kinds of subplots going on, and it follows 5 characters through the course of the evening, and there's kind of murder and mayhem and gunplay and all sorts of things going on.
What I think is interesting about the book too is how you get into the voice of each of the characters, because each time you have a chapter, you're just focused purely on that one character. How did you get into the voice?
You know, it started off, I think, with the first chapter. I just had a third-person narrator. I had one character that I had latched onto, and it really wasn't until I'd finished that first section and suddenly I found myself writing about this crazy drug dealer named Vince Thompson. And I didn't even know that I was really going to shift perspective and move to that point of view. And when I started writing his character, and it just started taking off, and there were these long sentences that just kept going and going in this kind of, this rage that drives this guy somehow. And it felt good, so I just kept doing it. And then I got done with that chapter, and I was like, well, okay, I guess I'm going to do, a point of view for each of these individual characters, which I hadn't planned on doing. So then it was a matter of, how do you make the voices different? How do you make each of them has to sound a little bit different. Each of them has to think differently.
Okay, so what was the spark for the book?
I had this idea for a short story for years about this kind of happy-go-lucky dude who's, like in his 20s and just kind of living in this small town, working a dead-end job, who was like everybody's buddy, but who had gotten in a lot of trouble because he was doing drugs and he's borrowing money from everybody and owes everybody in town money and has, gotten this girl pregnant. And it was all supposed to take place. It was all going to be around that one character, Russell Harmon, and it was going to be a short story. And then when I started writing it, I suddenly started getting interested in these other characters. These other characters started creeping into the narrative. And that's what really happened. I don't know how far along I was actually with what I thought was a short story when I suddenly started to realize it's like, no, this isn't gonna be 15 pages, and then I suddenly started realizing these other characters are crowding in, and it's their story as well as his. So it actually started as a short story.
You know what? I'm not surprised. It's really, because I read some of your short stories and I thought, wow, it seemed like the novel would have begun as a short story. You're very character driven, I would say.
Yeah, I think typically. Yeah. I have a collection of short stories coming out from Tin House next spring that has some stories in it that are more experimental and maybe not quite so character based. But yeah, typically that's where it starts for me.
One of the other things I'm curious about too is again the writing style. Have you always been a writer?
That was kind of it. I was in a local playwrights festival, and I was seeing some of the things that people were writing that I was acting in, and I was like, you know what, I can do this. And so the first thing I wrote was I did write a play, which was horrible, and I don't like to be reminded of it. And then after that, I started reading a lot of novels, and after a while, you start to get this feeling. For me, at least, it was. Literature made such a difference in my life when I was in, late teens, early 20s, and you start to wonder at a certain point, like, do I have anything to contribute? There's this conversation that's been going on for hundreds of years, across all these countries and all these different languages, and you start wondering if you have, some voice, however small, that fits in there someplace. So I didn't really start, it was a conscious decision to try to start writing was in my early 20s.
This is really interesting because earlier in our conversation you spoke about how you were entranced by literature and in some way wanted to contribute to it. So how do you see you're doing? How do you feel you're doing so far?
I hope I'm doing okay. You can't, what can you do about that? You can't, you write the best that you can write, and you try to get the stuff out there, and you hope that people read it, and you can't control who wants to publish what, and what sells how many copies, and who says what about it. You just can't control that stuff. You have to just think about what you're doing when you're writing. And I guess the thing I fault myself for more than anything else is that I don't write enough. That I sometimes I don't like writing.
You don't like writing?
There are writers who just love to sit down and write. I hate sitting down to write. I mean, to me, it's all about, I feel the same way about it that I feel about running. I could run like 5 or 6 miles 3 or 4 times a week. And I hate it. I hate putting on my jogging shoes and going out and running. It's hard. But when I get done with it, I feel better, and I'm relaxed and peaceful and calm, and it's nice. And I kind of feel the same way about writing. Like, I don't like writing. I like having written. And so sometimes it's hard to get me started, and I'll do anything. If I go into a room to write, I'll find any way to procrastinate that there possibly is. I mean, I'll doodle, play with a pen, anything. And so that's what I fault myself more than anything else, is that I keep thinking I'm going to fall in love with the writing process, and that it's going to be something that I just get up in the morning like, wow, I can't wait to start writing today, but it never is.
It sounds as if there's something inside you that drives you, because, for example, this being a short story that turned into a novel, I mean, that's not the mark of a guy that doesn't like to write particularly.
Like, okay, I want to put together a body of work of which I can be proud because I tried my best. And then whether other people want to read it, what other people make of it is up to them. But yeah, so that's it. I mean, it's just like, I teach writing in college, and it's like, well, I feel it's like I have to teach this class the best that I can teach this class. I have to take all of these writers in this class, and I have to do what I can do to make their stories the best that they can be. That's my job. That's what I do. So I get it's kind of that's sort of the way it is to me.
What advice do you have for young writers?
Just keep writing. I mean, the most important thing to me is, like, I don't think the people who make it anywhere and who get to the point where they are publishing and they're getting their stuff out there, it's not necessarily the best writers. It's not the people with the most talent. I mean, sure, that helps, but the kind of perseverance, you just have to, and it's all these rejections. I got hundreds. I still do. Between my first published short story and my second story, I got over 100 rejection letters. The first one was pretty easy. Well, I shouldn't say easy. I mean, I'd spent years writing, but I had not been submitting stories for very long before a pretty good literary journal picked up this first story of mine. And I thought, what's everybody talking about? It's like, this is easy, and yeah, 100 rejections later, and I don't know how many more stories, a dozen more stories I'd written before I finally got the second one published. And I can remember, I think the nicest thing my wife has ever said to me was, I can remember after one round of these rejections came in, sitting there dutifully putting the stamps on these envelopes and sending out these stories, for like another round of submissions. And she was just kind of standing there watching me, and she finally said, well, you're the most persistent person I know.
Where do you hope your books land on the shelves? What do you hope you will have contributed?
They're in the M's right before, Toni Morrison, and right after, they're alphabetized and they're in the M's someplace on the shelves. I don't know. Yeah, if they're just on the shelves somewhere, that would be nice. If they're just on somebody's shelf, I can't think about that stuff. I don't want. I think if you start thinking about those things too much, you can't become selfish as a writer. If you're writing for yourself, like to try to get something out of it, like you know what I mean? Like, if there's some material thing, like, oh gee, I really want to, I want a bigger house, so I'm going to write this novel and I'm going to sell, a bazillion copies. It ain't going to happen probably. And I just, that's not the right spirit of endeavor, I don't think, with writing anyway. So I just can't think about that stuff. I don't know. All I can do is just write the books.
Keith Lee Morris, a bullseye. Thank you. I'm Diana Page Jordan. We're at the Writer's Dojo, and thank you so very much for joining us today.